Needle, or Arya Stark's sword. Is it realistic? Or rather, if you had it in a real-life battle, would it be able to save your life? Greetings, traveler, I'm SnapJelly, and today we're gonna take a look at Arya Stark's sword and how effective it would be in an actual real-life sword fight. So in order to figure this out, we are first gonna have to take a look at the design of her sword and the key aspects of her sword. Now, the design itself is actually pretty simple. Looking at the hilt, it has a very small, simple crossguard with a singular side ring for extra hand protection, and a very thin blade, probably primarily intended for thrusting. Although the sword also has some cutting capacity, as we see Arya Stark cut a candle very smoothly. Now, a candle doesn't offer much resistance, but to be able to cut it smoothly, you still need a sharp edge. Also, in any close-up shots that I found, it appears that the sword is double-edged. Now, to be able to fairly judge if this sword would be effective, we are going to have to take a look at any historical examples that we might be able to compare this design to. Now, when I looked at the hilt and the side ring, the first thing that popped into my mind were some of the earliest forms of fencing foil that were used in the 18th and 19th century. There were some with a closed double shell guard, sort of, but there were also a lot with open, sort of, double ring guards on both sides, and that's what it reminded me of. They were also sharp at the point because the duels that these were used in at the times were fought till first blood, but the main problem is that they're not sharp on the sides, and I didn't really find it a fair comparison because the foil originally was a practice weapon for the small sword. And when we talk about small swords, I think we're already getting a bit closer to Arya Stark's sword design. Small swords were gentlemen's weapons. They had very little amount of hand protection, like Arya Stark's sword, and they are thin and nimble, like Needle is. Again, one problem though, and that is that the small sword is not sharp at the edge. It is just a thrusting weapon. Small swords have a triangular cross-section, meaning that the blade is somewhat triangular shape, and it was not sharpened. It was just a thrusting weapon. So looking at a small sword that is sharp on the edge, there's only one sword that remains, and that is the spadroon. Now, spadroons are very similar to small swords. Essentially, they are sort of militarized small swords because they do have a sharp edge. Small swords were primarily worn by officers. They were not known for being very good at fighting, but they are functional. There are, however, a few problems that I have with comparing a spadroon to Arya Stark's needle. One is the knuckle bow. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have never seen a spadroon without, at the very least, a knuckle bow. And Arya Stark's sword doesn't have that. Now, I have seen some small swords without a knuckle bow, but I've never seen a spadroon without a knuckle bow. There might be spadroons without one, but I've never seen one. That's one. And two is that spadroons are, essentially because of the knuckle bow, still single-edged and not double-edged. They do have a bit of a false edge at the tip, but this is blunt, never sharpened. Well, because you're never gonna use that edge. Because of the knuckle bow, you can only hold it one way. I would say that in Arya Stark's case, it would have been beneficial if Needle also had a knuckle bow, because Arya Stark as a character, if I'm right, is specifically left-handed. Right now, Arya Stark's sword does only have hand protection on one side, on the left side of her sword, to protect her left hand. Now, if it also had a knuckle bow, right, that would mean that you would not be able to use it in your right hand comfortably, because then the hand protection would be on the wrong side of your hand, right? So people would be less likely to steal it, I suppose. However, if it's double-edged and you only have one shell, then you can still just turn it around if it doesn't have a knuckle bow, and you can still use it and steal it and things like that. Another thing is the hand protection. Now, on most examples, spadroons usually have this double shell guard. Essentially, this one is a bit bent, as you can see, which is very common. But there are also spadroons that only have protection on one side, very similar to Arya Stark's sword design. And there are also spadroons, like this one, whoopsie daisy, that have a hinge in it, like this, which is, honestly, it's just for easy carrying, has no other purpose than that. But yeah, I have already made fun of that in the past, so I'm not going to do it again. Honestly, I would say that Arya Stark's sword or needle is a spadroon. A spadroon without a knucklebow. And could you use that? Yes. Is it the greatest sword to use? Not really. They are very light and nimble, but because they are light and nimble, they lack power. And because most swords in Game of Thrones are long swords or arming swords, yeah, those are not. Those are a bit heavier than spadroons are, and supposedly needle also is. So what happens is, let's grab it again. If you want to parry an attack, you are going to have to parry it very close to your hand, otherwise you're simply not going to be able to exert enough force to be able to parry the attack. Now, okay, first off, just to get this out of the way, right, you cannot cut through a spadroon blade. I know that people think that with rapiers as well, that the longsword will just chop through that. That is absolute horseshit. Please get your head out of the television and out of anime and into the real world. It's steel. With Valyrian steel, you might be able to do that, chop through a sword, but if you use real materials, you cannot do that. You can't chop through a sword with another sword. It doesn't happen. Alright? That out of the way. You are going to have to parry attacks very close to your hand if you want to have enough force to be able to parry the attack. And that is simply dangerous for your hand because there's not much hand protection going on. That's a downside. And another downside is, on specifically needle, that is not very long. I couldn't find a particular length that specifically needle is, but the actor for Arya, Maisie Williams, apparently is only 1 meter 55. That would be, compared to me, that would be around this tall. She would reach just underneath my chin, right? Now, this is the shortest spadroon that I own, and if I would just compare it to this arming sword over here, aligning the pommels, right, you can see this spadroon is longer. See that? They are thin and such, and incredibly light. And because they are thin, they are simply, you can simply allow them to be longer without gaining much weight. There's much less mass in this sword than there is in this sword, but this one is longer nonetheless. Arya Stark's needle seems to, even for her size, be quite short. And honestly, she already has a reach disadvantage because she is short herself. So by using a short sword, you are doubling the length disadvantage. That's not particularly smart. So conclusion, would you be able to use it? Yes, if you very specifically practice using this sword. You are going to have to be very comfortable with your sword, and then you could. But for most people, it's most likely not the smartest thing to do. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. And if you want to follow me on social media, you can. Links are in the description below. And thank you for joining my quest, and I hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye guys.